The morning light crept gently across the kitchen counter, tracing golden lines across a half-empty coffee mug and a pile of unopened mail. Emily Turner stood by the window watching the quiet street outside her suburban home, her hands wrapped around that same mug she'd been holding for the last 10 minutes. It was Sunday, the kind of calm day she used to look forward to. But lately, peace had started to feel lonely. The house, though filled with memories, had grown quieter since her husband Daniel began working longer hours. He was a good man, patient and steady. But work had a way of pulling him farther away from the home they'd built together. And then there was Ryan Daniel's 17-year-old son from his first marriage. He was polite and kind in his own quiet way, but Emily still struggled to read him. Sometimes he'd open up, telling her about his favorite bands or a project from school. Other times, he'd retreat into silence, his headphones becoming a wall between them. It wasn't tension, not exactly. It was distance. And Emily, despite her warm smile and careful patience, couldn't help but feel that she was standing just outside the circle of his world. She wanted that to change as the clock ticked softly in the background. Emily took a deep breath and told herself that today could be different. There didn't have to be a reason for a breakthrough. Sometimes all it took was a moment of kindness or an unexpected conversation to bridge a gap. She poured another cup of coffee, determined to fill the day with something meaningful. There was a sense of quiet hope in her movements, the kind that comes from someone who believes that connection, no matter how fragile, is still worth chasing. The house wasn't empty. It was waiting. Emily had always been the kind of person who believed in effort, in trying, even when things didn't seem to move forward. After her own difficult past, she had learned that relationships weren't built in grand gestures, but in small, patient steps. Her previous marriage had ended years ago, leaving her with lessons she carried like faint scars. Reminders of what happens when two people stop listening to one another. So when she met Daniel, a widower with a quiet charm and a steady heart, she had promised herself to do better this time. She didn't want to be just a presence in Ryan's life. She wanted to be someone he could trust, someone he could turn to, even if only for advice or laughter. But building a bond with a teenager wasn't simple. There were moments when he smiled, and moments when he seemed lost in thoughts she couldn't reach. Emily respected that, but sometimes in the quiet hours before dinner, she'd find herself wondering if he saw her as family at all. That morning, the air felt heavier than usual. The sky outside was pale, like it couldn't decide whether to rain or shine. Emily glanced at the calendar pinned near the fridge. A brunch was scheduled with her sister-in-law, but Daniel had texted earlier that he might not make it back in time. She sighed softly. Another Sunday that would start and end without him. It wasn't sadness that filled her, but a quiet ache, the kind that sits beneath the surface, waiting to be understood. She decided to distract herself with chores, turning on soft music as she folded laundry and watered the houseplants by the window. The rhythm of daily life gave her comfort. Each simple act was her way of saying, "I'm still trying." When Ryan's footsteps echoed down the stairs, she almost didn't hear them over the hum of the washing machine. He was heading out early, backpack slung over one shoulder, hair slightly messy, a hint of sleep still in his eyes. "Morning," Emily said, smiling as she set down a dish towel. "Morning," he replied, his voice low but polite. He hesitated near the door. "I'm going to Jake's. We're working on a project for class." "Sounds good," she said warmly. "Be safe, okay?" He nodded, and for a brief second their eyes met. There was something in his expression, not coldness, not even distance, just that quiet uncertainty of a boy still learning how to exist between childhood and adulthood. Then he was gone, and the sound of the front door closing left behind a stillness that filled the house once more. Emily looked around the kitchen and smiled faintly, even as she felt a familiar emptiness settling in. She wasn't lonely in the tragic sense. She simply missed the kind of closeness that came naturally to some families. The laughter, the chaos, the noise. Her home was peaceful. Yes, but sometimes peace could be a little too quiet. She poured herself another cup of coffee and stepped outside to the porch. The wind was cool, brushing gently against her hair. Across the street, a group of kids were riding their bikes, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. For a moment, Emily imagined a time not too far in the future, when she and Ryan might share small moments like that, laughter that came easily, words that didn't have to be measured. She didn't know what would spark that change, but she hoped it would come soon because underneath her calm, polite exterior, Emily carried a deep desire not for perfection, not even for recognition, but simply for understanding. That quiet wish lingered in her heart, like an unfinished sentence. And though she didn't know it yet, life was about to give her exactly what she'd been waiting for in the most unexpected, awkward, and oddly meaningful way. The rain began that afternoon, soft and steady, painting silver lines across the window panes. Emily loved days like this. Quiet, thoughtful days that made the world slow down. It's just enough for her to breathe. She sat by the kitchen table with a steaming cup of tea. The sound of rain, a gentle rhythm in the background. The stillness reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten. The early days when she first met Ryan. Back then, he had been shy but curious, standing half behind his father the day they were introduced. He must have been 15 then, tall for his age, with a kind of quiet intelligence in his eyes. Emily had tried her best to make him comfortable, asking simple questions about school, about his favorite music, about the dog he used to have. He had answered politely but cautiously, as though every word was a test of trust. And in many ways, it was Emily had known from the beginning that stepping into Ryan's life wouldn't be simple. She wasn't his mother, and she didn't want to take that place. But she did hope deeply and quietly that someday he'd see her as someone he could lean on. There were small victories at first. The first time he smiled at one of her terrible jokes. The first time he accepted her offer to help him with a school project. The first time he came home with good news and actually told her before anyone else. Those moments felt small then, but looking back now, they were pieces of something real, threads of connection slowly weaving a fragile bond between them. One memory stood out more clearly than the rest. It was the summer after. Emily and Daniel had married. The three of them had taken a short road trip to the coast just a few hours away. Nothing fancy. Daniel had fallen asleep in the passenger seat halfway there, leaving Emily and Ryan to fill the quiet for a while. They simply listened to music, Ryan choosing the songs, Emily nodding along even when she didn't know the lyrics. Then, out of nowhere, he'd said, "You're not what I expected." Emily glanced at him, surprised. "What did you expect?" "I don't know," he'd said with a small shrug. "Just not someone who laughs so much." She had laughed right then, a soft, genuine laugh that filled the car like sunlight. "I'll take that as a compliment." And Ryan, for the first time, had smiled. Really smiled. It was brief, but she remembered it even now. Like a snapshot of a fragile bridge being built between two people who were learning how to trust. But not all memories were easy. There were times when the distance between them seemed to stretch endlessly. Days when Ryan came home quiet and withdrawn, and Emily wasn't sure whether to ask what was wrong or give him space. She knew some of it came from the past, from the loss of his mother, from the confusion of watching his father move on, from the fear that letting Emily in would somehow mean letting go of what came before. She never blamed him for that. If anything, it made her more patient. She had seen pain like that before, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but sits quietly beneath everything a person does. It was the kind of ache that made people careful with their emotions, as though showing too much might somehow break what little they had left. So she waited. She didn't push, didn't pry. She simply stayed steady, kind, present, and slowly, piece by piece. Ryan began to trust that she wasn't going anywhere now, sitting by the rain-streaked window. Emily wondered if Ryan remembered those small moments too. Maybe he did. Even if he'd never say it out loud, she thought about the way he sometimes lingered at the table after dinner, helping her clear plates without being asked, or how he'd quietly fix something broken around the house without ever taking credit for it. It was his way of showing care, subtle, almost hidden but real. And even though they still had unspoken walls between them, She could feel that something meaningful was there. It just needed the right moment to surface. Later that evening, as she cleaned up the kitchen, Daniel called from his office upstairs, apologizing again for working late. Emily reassured him gently, telling him not to worry. But as she hung up, a faint sigh escaped her. She wasn't upset, she understood. Life was busy, people got caught up. But sometimes she missed the warmth of simple family dinners. The laughter that used to echo through the house when they first all moved in together. She missed connection. Not in the dramatic way that stories often tell it. Not with... The morning began like any other, quiet and predictable. Emily hummed softly to herself as she arranged fresh flowers in a vase by the kitchen window. The air smelled faintly of rain from the night before, and the sunlight filtering through the clouds painted everything in a muted, golden haze. She had always found comfort in simple routines, watering plants, folding laundry, making coffee just the way she liked it. They were her way of keeping life steady, especially in a household that, sometimes, felt like pieces still learning to fit together. Ryan had stayed at a friend's house the previous night. He often did on weekends, and Emily didn't mind. She liked knowing he had friends, that he was growing into his own person. Still, she found herself wondering when he'd be back. She wanted to talk to him, nothing serious, just to check in, maybe share a story or a laugh. The distance between them wasn't painful anymore, but it lingered like a faint shadow, waiting for something or perhaps someone to chase it away. A little after noon, she heard the front door creak open. Ryan. She called out. "Yeah, it's me," he replied, his voice carrying a tired warmth. Emily smiled as she walked toward the hallway, a hand still drying on the dish towel. "Welcome home hungry." He shrugged, smiling faintly. "A little." "Then you're in luck," she said with a grin. "I made pancakes." That got a real smile out of him, the kind that reached his eyes. For a moment, it felt almost like old times, the early days when they'd laugh over breakfast together. They sat across from each other at the table, the rain still whispering softly outside. It wasn't much, just a quiet meal. But it felt like a bridge being rebuilt, one piece at a time. When they finished, Ryan offered to help clean up. Emily appreciated that about him, his quiet sense of responsibility. He wasn't talkative, but his actions often spoke for him. As they cleared the dishes, she turned toward him. "How was your night at Jake's?" "Good," he said. "We stayed up too late working on the project, though." "What's it about again?" "Renewable energy models," he replied, his tone brightening slightly. "It's for our science fair. We're trying to make something that's not just a school project, but actually useful." Emily smiled, impressed. "That sounds incredible. You've always been good at thinking things through." He shrugged, almost bashful. "I just like solving problems." She laughed softly. "You and your dad are exactly the same that way." For a moment, that made him pause, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. "Yeah, maybe," he said quietly. It was a small thing that exchanged, but something about it felt different. Emily couldn't quite name it, but there was a new openness in his tone, a softness that hadn't been there for a while. Later that day, she decided to tackle the guest room closet, a long overdue project she had been putting off. As she sorted through old boxes and photo frames, she stumbled upon a dusty scrapbook she hadn't seen in years. Inside were pictures from that first summer trip, the one they'd taken to the coast together. There was a photo of Ryan and Daniel, both smiling beside the car, and another of Emily laughing with the wind in her hair. She turned the page and found a candid picture of the three of them sitting by the bonfire that night. Ryan had been roasting marshmallows. Daniel had an arm around both of them. Emily's eyes softened. That night had felt like the start of something good. The moment she'd believed they could truly become a family. She sighed and placed the album aside, lost in thought. A knock on the door pulled her back. "Hey," Ryan said, leaning against the doorway. "Need a hand?" She smiled. "You read my mind." Together, they sorted through boxes, organizing old things into piles for keeping or donation. Ryan found his old baseball glove, the one he hadn't used in years. "Wow," he said, holding it up. "Didn't think this still existed." Almost donated it once, Emily teased. But I thought you might want it someday. He smiled, a mix of surprise and appreciation. You really kept all this? Of course, she said softly. They're part of our story. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of emotion that was half grateful, half wistful. You always think about stuff like that, don't you? I try to, she admitted. Sometimes small things hold more meaning than we realize. As the afternoon went on, they found themselves talking more about old memories, funny moments, even little regrets. The house felt different, lighter somehow, at one point. A framed photo slipped from a box, landing face down on the floor. Ryan picked it up, brushing off the dust. It was a picture of Daniel and Emily at their wedding, both smiling brightly. Ryan studied it for a moment before saying quietly, "He really loves you, you know?" Emily looked at him, touched by the sincerity in his voice. "And I love him," she said. "But you're part of that too, Ryan. You always have been." He looked surprised, like he hadn't expected her to say that. For a long second, he didn't speak. Then he nodded, his voice steady. "Thanks. That means a lot." That small moment, that simple exchange, became the quiet twist neither of them saw coming. It wasn't dramatic or loud. There were no tears or confessions. Just understanding, deep, wordless understanding. Something in Ryan's eyes softened that day. As though the walls he'd quietly built around himself had finally begun to lower. And Emily, in turn, felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. They spent the rest of the afternoon finishing the closet, sharing laughter that felt natural again. It was ordinary, yes, but in that ordinariness, something extraordinary was happening. Fate hadn't brought them together through tragedy or grand gestures. It had used the simplest thing, a shared afternoon, a forgotten photo, a quiet conversation to remind them that connection can begin again at any moment and that day. Without realizing it, both Emily and Ryan stepped into a new chapter, one built not on awkward silences, but on the courage to see each other as they truly were. The next few days moved quietly. Like pages turning in a book no one rushed to finish. The air in the house felt gentler now, lighter somehow, as if something unspoken had finally begun to heal. Yet beneath that calm, both Emily and Ryan carried thoughts they couldn't quite name. It wasn't tension anymore. It was something softer, something that existed in pauses, in glances, in the way they seemed to understand each other without words. Emily noticed it one evening while setting the table for dinner. Ryan had offered to help again, something he rarely did before. He folded napkins carefully, lining them up as though the small act mattered. When their hands brushed while passing a plate, both hesitated for a second. It was brief, harmless, yet filled with a quiet awareness neither could ignore. Emily smiled politely, masking the small flutter of emotion that caught her by surprise. She wasn't sure why it felt so heavy. It wasn't attraction in the way stories told it, but a deep recognition, an unspoken care. For the first time in a long while, she realized how much she wanted to be understood, not as a wife or a stepmother, but simply as a person trying to do her best. Dinner that night was peaceful. Daniel had returned home earlier than usual, tired but cheerful. Conversation flowed easily about work, about Ryan's project, about the movie they might watch later. But Emily found herself distracted, not by discomfort, but by reflection. She watched Ryan talking to his father, noticed the way he smiled more now, how his voice had a steadiness that wasn't there before. It made her proud. She remembered the boy who barely spoke to her 2 years ago, the one who hid behind headphones and brief replies. And now, here he was, sharing his thoughts openly. His eyes bright with confidence. That quiet transformation filled her heart with warmth. It wasn't maternal pride alone. It was something broader, the fulfillment of seeing someone grow, heal, and let others in. She caught herself smiling softly. Ryan noticed, and their eyes met for just a second. It was a simple look, a shared gratitude that didn't need words. Later that evening, after Daniel went upstairs to take a call, Emily lingered in the living room, stacking plates and gathering cups. Ryan stayed behind too, scrolling absently through his phone. "You don't have to help," she said lightly. I don't mind, he replied, putting his phone away. Besides, I think we make a pretty good team. Emily laughed quietly. That we do. There was a pause, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable but filled with quiet thought. The kind that only happens between people who've learned to sit in silence without needing to fill it. Hey, Ryan said after a while, his tone thoughtful. Can I ask you something? Of course. He hesitated, then spoke slowly. Did you ever think it was hard? Coming into someone else's family. The question caught her off guard. Hard, she repeated softly. Yes, at times. He looked at her, curious. Emily took a slow breath. When I married your dad, I knew it wasn't just about him. It meant building a connection with you, too. I wanted to get it right to make you feel like you still had your space, but also a home that cared for you. Ryan nodded, thoughtful. You did. Even when I didn't make it easy. She smiled gently. You were just figuring things out. We all were. There was silence again, not cold, but full of meaning. It was in that stillness that the truth sat quietly between them, that they had both changed each other. Quietly, without ever saying it aloud. The rain started again, tapping lightly against the windows. Emily moved to close one of them, but paused, listening to the soft rhythm. Funny, she said with a small smile. Every important conversation we've had seems to happen when it rains. The sun had begun to set, spilling a warm orange glow through the living room windows. The house was quiet, aside from the gentle ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of a distant lawnmower. Emily sat on the couch, absent-mindedly folding a blanket. But her mind was elsewhere. It had been a week since the rain-soaked conversation with Ryan, the one that had reminded her just how much of themselves they had kept hidden from each other. Since then, the days had been peaceful. Yet the air was heavy with the things they still didn't say. Emily could feel it. A gentle tension between them, a quiet ache of unspoken truths. She knew that Ryan felt it too. He had started staying home more in the afternoons, lingering around the kitchen or the living room, as if waiting for a moment he wasn't sure how to create. That evening, Emily was rearranging the living room bookshelves when she heard Ryan's footsteps approaching. He paused near the doorway, holding a notebook close to his chest. Hey, he said softly. Hey, she replied, looking up. How was homework? He shrugged. Done, but I wanted to talk to you about something. Emily set the book down, sensing the gravity in his tone. Of course, she said. Sit down. Ryan walked over and sat across from her, his hands fidgeting nervously. Emily studied him quietly. He had always carried himself with a certain guarded calm. But tonight, there was a vulnerability there that made her heart ache. After a pause, he spoke. I've been thinking about us, about how I feel sometimes and how I act. Emily nodded, encouraging him without interrupting. He took a deep breath. I know I haven't always shown it, but I'm glad you're in my life. You've always tried to understand me, even when I didn't want to be understood. And I guess I wanted to say I appreciate it, really. Emily felt her chest tighten. It wasn't just the words, it was the honesty behind them. For so long they had danced around emotions, avoiding the things that mattered most. And now Ryan was finally speaking them aloud. I didn't know how to say it before, he continued. Sometimes I get frustrated or I feel like I'm not supposed to let anyone in. But with you, it's different. You make me feel like it's okay to be myself. And I don't know how to explain it, but I think that's important. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tightening. It is important, she said softly. More than you might realize. And I want you to know that all this time I've cared. Not just as your stepmother, but as someone who wants to see you happy and understood. You matter to me. Ryan looked at her, his eyes wide, a small smile breaking through his nervous expression. I didn't know if I'd ever get to say that, or if it would even matter. It matters more than you know, Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. She reached out, lightly resting her hand on his. The gesture was simple, safe, and full of warmth, a physical bridge for the emotional one they were building. For a long moment, they sat like that, hand in hand, neither speaking but both understanding. Then Ryan spoke again, quieter this time. I guess I've been scared too. Scared of letting someone in, scared of change. But you've made it easier, even if I didn't say it. Emily smiled, a soft, bittersweet smile. Fear is normal, she said. But so is hope. And I think we've both been holding on to hope without realizing it. Ryan nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He seemed smaller somehow. Not in stature, but in the weight he carried, as if speaking aloud the feelings he had kept buried lifted some invisible burden. Emily realized that this was what she had been waiting for. The moment when patience and understanding met courage. When silence could no longer hold them back, and truth, gentle and honest, stepped into the open. They spent the next hour talking quietly about the small things that had mattered all along, memories of family trips, funny stories from school, moments when they had almost laughed but didn't. Each anecdote carried weight now, because it was spoken aloud, shared, and acknowledged. Emily found herself laughing softly at something Ryan said about his science project. And Ryan, in turn, smiled at the way she remembered details he thought she had forgotten. It was ordinary and extraordinary all at once, the way connection often is. There was no dramatic confession, no life-changing event, just truth spoken in the warmth of a quiet home. In the simple acknowledgement of care and understanding, by the time the clock chimed 9, both of them felt lighter. The house felt warmer somehow, filled with the comfort of honesty and mutual respect. As Ryan stood to leave, he paused at the doorway. Thanks for listening, for really listening. Lee's eyes glistened. Always, she whispered. And in that simple exchange, the turning point had arrived. No grand gestures, no dramatic speeches, just hearts opened, barriers lowered, and the quiet, profound understanding that they were stronger together than apart. Emily knew that from this moment on, nothing would be quite the same. And she didn't mind, because sometimes the most meaningful love, the kind that lasts, begins in patience, grows in trust, and blooms in the quiet courage to speak what has long been left unspoken. The morning sun spilled softly across the living room, illuminating the warm hues of the walls and the familiar clutter of books, blankets, and scattered cushions. Emily sat in her favorite chair with a mug of tea, savoring the quiet hum of a home that had, at last, begun to feel fully alive again. The week that had followed Ryan's heartfelt conversation felt like a gentle turning of a page. The air in the house was lighter now, not because anything dramatic had changed, but because understanding had finally been spoken aloud. Ryan entered the room, stretching after a morning run. He paused for a moment at the doorway, noticing her relaxed posture. For a brief second, he simply watched her, as if memorizing the comfort and patience she always carried with her. Then he smiled, and Emily returned it without hesitation. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of a week's worth of unspoken emotions finally finding their voice. They no longer had to navigate silent walls or tentative glances. "Morning," Emily said softly, setting her mug down. "Morning," Ryan replied. He moved toward the window and looked out at the street, still wet from the previous night's rain. "It's nice out." Emily joined him, standing beside the window. "Yeah," she said. "Perfect for starting fresh." He nodded. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, content to simply be near one another. The silence was no longer heavy. It was filled with an ease that only comes from shared understanding. Later that day, Daniel returned from work earlier than usual. Emily and Ryan were preparing lunch together, a casual routine that had become a comforting rhythm in their lives. The kitchen was filled with laughter as they recounted small stories from the past week, each of them noticing details about the other that had previously gone unspoken. "Hey," Daniel said as he walked in. "Smells amazing in here. What are you two up to?" Emily smiled, placing a plate on the counter. "Just helping each other with lunch." "Teamwork, Dad." Ryan grinned. "Yeah, teamwork." Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "You two make a good team, I must say." Emily and Ryan exchanged a glance, a subtle acknowledgement of how far they had come. There had been awkwardness once, moments of silence that felt unbearable, yet now they worked together with natural ease. The bonds of family, strengthened by patience and honesty, had finally begun to feel secure. After lunch, Ryan grabbed a photo album from the living room shelf. "Hey, remember this?" he asked, flipping it open to a page full of candid snapshots from their first family trip together. Emily leaned over to look, her heart warming at the memories. "I remember that day," she said softly. "You were so nervous about the bonfire." He laughed. "I was. But I also remember you helping me get over it. You always knew when to step in and when to just let me figure things out. That's all anyone can do sometimes," she replied. "Help and wait for the moment when things feel right." They shared a quiet smile. The words weren't dramatic, but they were enough. Enough to show that their relationship had grown beyond awkwardness, beyond hesitation into trust, care, and mutual respect. That evening, Emily found herself alone in the living room for a few moments, the house settling into its nighttime calm. She glanced out the window, where the sky glowed with the soft colors of sunset. For a moment she reflected on the journey they had all taken, the small missteps, the quiet struggles, and the breakthroughs that had finally brought them closer. She realized that love, in all its forms, often didn't arrive as a grand gesture. Sometimes it came in the small, patient ways. A shared laugh, a kind word, the courage to speak what had long been unspoken. She felt gratitude for those moments and for the people who had made them possible. Daniel, who had shown steadfastness. Ryan, who had found the courage to be honest. And herself, for trusting that patience and understanding were worth the effort later. Ryan joined her in the living room, carrying a book he had been reading. "Want to read together?" he asked, a soft smile on his face. Emily nodded. "I'd like that." They sat side by side on the couch, the book open between them. But more than the words on the page, it was the shared quiet that mattered. A week ago, such a moment might have been impossible. Now it felt effortless, full of warmth, understanding, and the subtle comfort of family. Neither needed to speak of the awkward moments of the past. They were there, acknowledged, and they had led to this moment, a connection solidified through honesty, patience, and care. As the evening wove,